Hello, my name is Stacey Osborne. I'm the Communications Director for the City of Taylor, and I'm here today with our Finance Director, Jeff Wood. He's going to tell us about the tax rate hearing that will be part of the City Council meeting scheduled for Thursday, September 10th, and he'll be answering a few questions about it so that you'll know what's coming up. Welcome, Jeff.
Welcome, glad to be here.
Good, nice to have you. So let's get right into this. Tell us a little bit, first of all, what is the tax rate hearing? Why do we have one? Like, what's the point of doing it?
So a tax rate hearing, every year we have to adopt a tax rate that supports the budget, which council will adopt just prior to the tax rate. And the purpose of adopting a tax rate and having the hearing before we adopt that tax rate is to allow public input. It's the opportunity for the public to share their comments about the tax rate, whether they agree, disagree, or any other general comment they may have. But it gives the public an opportunity to have a say in council's decisions.
So how much of the city's annual budget actually comes from property taxes, which is the rate that we're going to be discussing on the 10th?
Sure, so let's take a look at that.
Okay.
What you'll see is, first, as we talk about the property tax bill itself, because everybody gets a tax bill, a property tax bill, and some people, their assumption is that that all goes to the city, and that's not true. As we can see here from this chart, the city only gets about 29% of what the tax bill actually is. So 29 cents on every dollar in property tax paid by a citizen in the city of Taylor comes to the city. Over half of it goes to the school. The rest goes to the county or the Brushy Creek drainage system. So we want to keep in mind that the city doesn't get all of your tax dollars. So when we look at how much of your tax dollars, how much revenue from the city is actually from those tax dollars, what we see is about 47% of the city's revenues come from property taxes. Property taxes and sales tax are the two biggest revenue sources for the city of Taylor. And again, property tax is about half of that. So any type of change in the tax rate or change in the level of tax revenues has a huge impact on the city's overall general fund budget. And again, the general fund budget is the budget that we use for all the day-to-day operations of the city. That's your police, your fire, your public works, your park systems and everything like that. Those things are all maintained from the general fund. So that's what property taxes go to support.
Now, in this last state legislative session, they made some changes to the property tax law. Can you kind of explain those changes and tell us what these new terms mean that we're going to be hearing at this tax rate seminar hearing?
Sure, absolutely. So let's take a look at the changes that were done in this last legislative session, because there were numerous changes. And this is just kind of a quick summary of them. There were the new tax rates that we'll talk about here quickly in a second that you talked about. Another big change that a lot of people are familiar with was the new law caps the amount of tax increase to 3.5% without a vote of the people. So if a city wants to raise their tax rate above 3.5%, it requires an automatic election during the November election. So that's a huge, in the past, it was 8%. A lot of people remember the rollback rate of 8%. The new law now limits that to 3.5%. For cities under 30,000, the new law also created a new rate called the de minimis rate, which we'll talk about here in a second. The new law also created some additional requirements in the public notices. There's a different notice that we have to use now that has a chart and some additional verbiage in it. It also changed the timing of notice. We can't publish a notice now until after the appraisal district sends out a postcard by August 7th that notifies homeowners or property owners of a website that they can go to and view the latest tax truth and taxation information. It also changed the number of hearings. In the past, if we were going to set a rate above the rate that doesn't increase taxes, we had to have 2 hearings. Now we're only required to have 1 public hearing on that tax increase. And as I mentioned, it also created that website that the appraisal district has to host now. So when we look at the terms, we used to call it the effective tax rate. That is now known as the no new revenue tax rate. It's the same rate as far as the calculation, and that is the rate that produces the same amount of tax dollars as the previous year on properties that existed the previous year. So if a house existed last year, what we're looking for is the rate that creates the same number of tax dollars on the house this year, and that rate is adjusted for any increase in value again, so it creates the same number of tax dollars. So the rate would go down slightly if the value went up, and that's what the no new revenue rate is designed to do. The second new rate, what used to be the rollback rate at 8%, is now called the voter approval tax rate, and that again is set at 3.5%. If you exceed that 3.5% rate, it requires an automatic election, hence the term voter approval tax rate now. The de minimis rate, as we mentioned, this is the new one that was created for cities under 30,000 in population. And the de minimis rate is a rate that produces $500,000 in tax revenue. So you look at the current value of the city and you determine what the rate is that creates $500,000. You then take that rate, which is usually only a few pennies, and you add that to your no new revenue maintenance and operation rate, and then add your debt service rate on top of that, and that creates your de minimis rate. And for the city of Taylor, we have to calculate that out every year in addition to the other 2 rates. And then the final rate that we have to calculate out is the debt service tax rate. And this is the rate required to produce enough tax revenue to pay the annual debt payment. We call it debt service. There's been some questions about, well, what do you service in debt? Servicing a debt is simply making the payment on the debt, your annual payment. That's called servicing the debt. So that's why this is called a debt service tax rate, is because we are servicing that debt by making that annual payment. And this is the rate that produces the money required to make that payment. And then the final rate that you'll see us talk about during budget discussions will be the budgeted rate. That's the rate that the budget is built around. That's the rate that's needed to support the budget as presented to council.
Thank you so much. Lots of interesting terms with this new property tax law.
Lots of changes.
Can you tell us,
yeah.
Yeah, lots of changes. So thank you for helping us to understand those a little bit better. Can you tell us who calculates the tax rates and what those rates are for 2020?
Sure. The tax rates are actually calculated by the county tax assessor collection office. They do that on our behalf. We work with them on those tax calculations, but they are the one who is actually responsible for calculating out those tax rates. The appraisal district, again, is the one that determines the values on the property. And then the assessor's office is the one that takes those values and determines what those rates are, the no new revenue rate, the voter approval rate, the de minimis rate. And then we work with them with what our debt obligation is for that next year. And that's what allows them to calculate out that debt service rate. So if we take a look at what those rates will be for this 2020 year, as you can see, the no new revenue rate is just over 80 cents at 80.24 cents per $100 of valuation. The voter approval rate is set at 82.11 cents per $100 of valuation. And both of those rates get a sales tax adjustment. The city of Taylor collects a 1/2 cent sales tax for property tax relief. And so both of those revenues are reduced to offset that sales tax collection. So as you can see, both the no new revenue and voter approval rates are adjusted by a sales tax collection. And for this 2020 year, that sales tax adjustment is just a little over 9 cents. So 9 cents in property tax rate is reduced because of sales tax that are paid within the city of Taylor. And those sales tax, of course, are paid by people who live within Taylor, but also people who visit Taylor and spend money in Taylor. So that's truly a benefit for the homeowners and property owners in the city of Taylor. The de minimis rate does not receive that adjustment for sales tax. I think it is a quirk in the law that they will probably review because without that adjustment, that rate ends up being significantly higher and generates way more than the 500,000 that the law intended. So I anticipate that'll be reviewed. But for this year, there is not a sales tax adjustment. So that rate is significantly higher than the other rates and looks kind of out of place because of that. The debt service tax rate, as we talked about before, that is set at 19.5 cents. That's the rate required when you look at our value to produce enough money to pay the annual debt requirement. And then the budgeted rate is set at 80.92 cents, just a little bit higher than the no new revenue rate. In fact, that's about 0.84%, so less than 1% higher than the no new revenue tax rate for 2020. And it is the same rate that was proposed and adopted last year for the fiscal year 2019-2020. So the rate is the same. Any tax increase people see will be a result of property value increases and not an increase to the actual tax rate itself.
Great. I'm going to throw a couple of more terms at you. We hear a lot of discussion about the M&O rate and also the INS rate, but what are those and what does that mean? What do those acronyms stand for?
Yeah, the M&O rate stands for maintenance and operation, and that is the tax money that goes to the general fund. Again, as we talked about, the general fund is that fund that provides the funds for the day-to-day operation of the city. So that M&O rate is the tax dollars that provides for that day-to-day operation. That supports your police and fire department, your parks, your public works, street maintenance type projects, and those things. That's the day-to-day operation money. INS is another term for the debt service rate, and that's the portion of the tax rate that goes to the annual debt payment. And again, we issue debt on a regular basis, as do every city, for multiple purposes, whether it's facilities or whether it's street repairs or park improvements. We issue debt. And so that INS supports those debt payments. Just like a mortgage, you have an annual payment or a monthly payment that you have to make on that mortgage. We have annual payments that we have to make on all that debt that we issued before. And that cumulative amount is what is owed on an annual basis and is the result of the INS payment.
Great. So how much revenue do those rates actually generate?
Yeah, so let's take a look at this because we share this with council every year also. So as you can see, the no new revenue rate, budgeted rate, voter approval rate, and de minimis rate are calculated out for council, and we give them the total tax dollars. We show them what the M&O amount is and the INS amount is. And then we also show them what the collection rate is, what we anticipate we'll actually collect in the fiscal year. Now, we anticipate we will collect 100% of that tax. However, we don't collect 100% of it in the fiscal year. Some of it gets paid late, and some of that gets paid late enough. It's in a different fiscal year, and we account for it a little bit differently than we do just for taxes that are paid on time. So we have to anticipate how much of that we'll actually collect in a given fiscal year. So we do that every year and present to council what that collection rate is, and then that is the number that we base our budget on. If we collect more than that, that's a bonus. But if we don't want to over assume what we're going to collect and then get in a position where we don't collect as much as we thought we would, and then the budget is short on the revenues, and then we have to look at reducing expenditures to offset that. So we try to be a little bit conservative on that, but still get it as close as we possibly can, because we don't want to, leave money not in the budget that could be used for things that we need to do in the city of Taylor and we want to budget for. So we try to get that as close as possible. So again, the budgeted rate is the rate that we use to support the budget. And as you can see, total tax, that rate is just over $10 million. The INS portion, again, is fixed. That is our debt payment for the year. So that doesn't get adjusted other than to meet that debt payment. And then the M&O is the part that goes to the general fund. And we're anticipating a 98% collection rate. That'll be just under 7.5 million. And that's the amount we have built into the budget.
Thank you, Jeff. So if the proposed tax rate is passed, how is that going to affect taxpayers? Like, what is the what will that mean to them? I know that we have all these rates going around, but what is that actually going to mean for their tax bill every year?
Sure. Again, as we talked about, the tax rate's the same as last year. So any increase that they see in property taxes will be a result of an increase in the value of their property. So we have to, every year, we have to do a calculation out for the state based on $100,000 of value. So if we look at $100,000 in value, again, the no new revenue rate is the rate that is supposed to produce the same amount of tax on that property as last year. So what we look at is the difference between the no new revenue rate and the proposed rate on the M&O side. And on a property of $100,000, that would result in a $6.75 property tax increase. So council always asks us every year, that's great, but nobody owns a $100,000 house. What is the average house in the city of Taylor? So we look at the average house in the city of Taylor, and for this tax year, the average house will have a value of $148,366. And if we look at the difference between the no new revenue rate and the budgeted rate on a house of $148,300, the increase for property taxes will be $10.
Excellent, thank you. So a lot of people, we've talked a lot about the budget internally when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm sure that people have been wondering how that might have affected the tax revenue for the city of Taylor and whether or not that influenced the rate that's being proposed on September 10th. Can you speak to that?
Sure. This is kind of an interesting subject to discuss, actually. When coronavirus started spreading in early March, and the governor ordered basically a shutdown of the economy, myself, other city finance directors, and practically every economist in the country expected that consumer spending would fall. And it did. I mean, we saw the largest single quarter drop off in GDP in the second quarter of this year that this country has ever seen, even going back to the Depression era. We've never seen a GDP fall off at an annualized rate of 32% in one quarter. So that was huge. But the uniqueness of Taylor is the stimulus money that was in the community, and the fact that a lot more people were working from home, so staying within the city of Taylor instead of traveling outside the city of Taylor to one of the neighboring communities and spending money within the city of Taylor. We actually saw huge sales tax collections. In fact, the last 4 months, we've had sales tax collections over $400,000, which has never happened in the city of Taylor, at least has never happened going back to 1987. And based on the collection levels in 87, I would assume has never happened prior to that either. And then the last month, we saw the third highest sales tax collection for a single month ever. So, I would have never anticipated that we would have saw that type of consumer spending at a time that restaurants were closed down or restricted to 50%. Our bars were closed down. Some of your retail was shut down. So we had enormous consumer spending in Taylor that just, really it doesn't make sense given what else was going on in the economy. So from a budgeting standpoint, that was good for this fiscal year budget, but it also did not put us behind or in the hole to where we had to do anything with the property tax rate for next year to try to make up for that. So the property tax rate, again, is the same as it was this year because of those sales tax collections. We're not in a position of making things up. So it really did not have an impact at all on next year's property tax rate for the reason because of the sales tax collections we saw the last 4 months.
That's so interesting.
It really is. I mean, because you
play out.
Yeah, when you think about it, hotel occupancy is down, so our hotel occupancy tax collections have been down. Our park rentals are down because nobody's using the parks. The parks are closed. Our league fees are way down because you don't have any of your league activities going on again because parks are closed and the restrictions that are in place because of COVID. Pavilion rentals are down because nobody can run a pavilion, again, because the parks are closed to large gatherings. So we've seen those incomes are down, but again, the larger than expected sales tax revenues have offset that. So, our budget is kind of right in line with where we thought it would have been pre-COVID. And as a result, we haven't had to make adjustments to the tax rate because of that. So
that's good news, and good news for the city of Taylor, and hopefully it'll stay that way for the next few months as we go into this fall and see what happens. So going back to the tax rate, if the tax rate is passed, and as you said, it's not really changing, but when will that take effect?
It'll take
September 10th.
I'm sorry. It'll take effect for this tax season. So the tax bills that go out at the beginning of October will have that new rate on it, which again is the same rate as last year, but it'll be for this tax season. So it'll be for this tax bill that goes out in October.
Great. Now we encourage residents to participate in the process. So can you tell us a little bit about how people can participate if they want to, and participate in this hearing on September 10th?
Sure. So we will conduct both a budget hearing and a tax rate hearing on September 10th. Both of those are going to be held virtually, just as all of our council meetings have been held. So people who wish to make a public comment, they can do that three ways. They can either send in their public comment to the city clerk, and they will be read during the meeting, during the public hearing. They can make arrangements with the city clerk to do a virtual comment from home, or they will be able to come into City Hall and make a virtual comment on a computer that'll be set up in City Hall, and there'll be staff there to assist them in making that virtual comment. So we'll really have three ways that they'll be able to make comment virtually. However, the meeting itself is not held in City Hall. It'll be a virtual meeting for the safety of staff and the council members and the citizens that would normally show up for that meeting.
Well, I think that's all the questions I have, unless you'd like to say something else about the tax rate, Jeff.
Nope, it's just part of the process. We'll have the public hearings. Again, those are the opportunity for people to make comment either on the budget or on the tax rate. We welcome those comments again through one of those three means that we just talked about. There'll be information in the August 30th edition of the Taylor Press. Those postings will be in the paper, and again, that information will be available to them in the Taylor Press on August 30th.
Great. Well, thank you so much for spending the time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. And again, the tax rate hearing will be on Thursday, September 10th. It will be a virtual meeting, but public comments are welcome. If you're interested in commenting, you can reach out to our city secretary, and I'll put that information on our screen again here so you can see it. Her address is diana.barker@taylortx.gov. You can also reach her at 512-352-3676, extension 1214. Thank you all. We appreciate you being here, and thank you, Jeff, for your time.
Always a pleasure. You're welcome.